Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at MEREDA's 2025 Office Outlook panel discussion. My name is John Finnegan. I'm a broker at the Bowles Company and co-chair of MEREDA's Local Issues Committee. I'll be moderating this discussion. With me on stage is Gina Stewart and Nate Stevens. Gina Stewart leads SMRT's workplace design practice and has worked with many employers across the state and beyond, including LL Bean, Hannaford, and WEX, to develop research-based design solutions focused on maximizing return on investment. Nate Stevens is a managing partner and designated broker at the Bowles Company. He's been with Bowles since 2007, and this is his 11th year participating in the office component of the MEREDA Forecast Conference. Welcome, Nate and Gina. Our goal today is to discuss the prevailing trends in the office market, including the whys behind office space decision-making and how the office real estate sector is performing. We will get into the labor shortage and on how the labor shortage is impacting space decisions and the trend of amenitizing spaces. From there, we'll transition into the hard data about vacancy rates and why Portland and Southern Maine seem to be going against the grain of major cities. We're going to try to save a few minutes at the end for questions from the audience, so if you have any questions, please save them for the end. All right, Gina, I'm going to start with you. What are some of the biggest trends that you've seen as far as office space design?
Yeah, if we can pull up
my slide.
I got it right here.
Perfect. I think well-being really came to the forefront during the pandemic for obvious reasons, and it's really kind of stuck around as a major design influence, and rightly so. Employee well-being is really not only the right thing to do, but there's a huge opportunity for return on investment with that as well. And it's really the catalyst that we're seeing behind these other design influencers. So, it's the driver behind hybrid work. It's one of the major reasons why we're seeing really, bespoke space strategies, highly customized solutions. And that's the piece that I really want to dig into a little bit more, because I think that there's some kind of misconceptions around what's trendy in office environments today. I think, we've gotten to this really exciting place with work environments where it's really research-based and data-driven. It's not based on any, specific prevailing trends. And so we do a lot of employee engagement with our clients as part of our planning process. And it's really the best way for us to learn about organizational culture and the needs of the workforce. And those are the kind of driving factors behind, coming up with the right solutions for the client. And so, what we always hear from people when we have these conversations is this huge undertone of fear about open office environments, and now about unassigned seating. So hot desking, which is the worst term in the whole world. It's got such negative connotations to it, and whoever came up with it should be ashamed of themselves.
I kept using it during our prep meeting.
And I think, people now think of those two things as being very intertwined. So we have these conversations with people, and we end up having to kind of quell their fears that, nobody's goal is to be densifying space right now and really be shoving people into spaces that don't work. I think that open office trend was just so damaging to the industry. But again, we've really just gotten to this place where we're planning based on people's needs, and we're really trying to develop solutions that are mutually beneficial to employee and employer. So really driving a positive experience for people at work, making sure that spaces are highly functional when people come into the office. And this is also, highly beneficial to employers because it's keeping people productive. It's really keeping an eye to, overall business performance. And all of this said, we have implemented unassigned seating strategies very successfully, actually, both for Hannaford and for Aroma Joe's. But it's got to be the right solution for, the right client. So it's just one option in a huge landscape of options that are out there.
Real quick, because I want to get Nate involved too, but can you talk about just a couple of decisions that some of your clients have made geared towards getting people back into the office and having a hospitable environment that sort of promotes connectivity?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a lot of talk around amenities these days, and again, this is something that I think is really got to be highly focused on experience and really giving people a positive experience at work, and there's so much value to social connection. So we're really seeing a lot of kind of thoughtful spaces for people to run into each other and connect with one another. So really welcoming kitchen spaces, coffee lounges, and putting these kind of things, with directly in kind of circulation paths where people are really highly likely to run into one another and really have these sort of serendipitous moments to connect. So we're seeing a lot of that. And I think, again, this is that mutually beneficial scenario of like people, that's the number one driver that employees are looking for when they come back into the office, is that opportunity to connect with one another. And that, having belonging in your workplace is more likely to keep people there and have people not looking for a new job. And I actually read a really great article in Forbes recently. It was Ryan Anderson from Miller Knoll, a furniture manufacturer, was talking about psychological safety. And basically, when we trust our colleagues, we're more likely to throw out that crazy idea that could come up with a innovative solution. You're more likely to ask the dumb question and not be spinning our wheels on things. So there's a lot of value to social connections, again, for both employee and employer.
Leaving defense, then coming into this business, I can say there's absolutely benefit to having that caring, fostering culture where people feel safe to express their ideas. Nate, same question to you. What are some of the biggest trends that you've seen in the office market this past year?
Hi, everyone. So starting big picture, I think some of my trends overlap with what Gina was talking about, but starting kind of big picture is that I think it's important to note that we're still kind of feeling the effects of the pandemic on the leasing side of office space. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone in this room. We're not quite out of the woods yet. The vacancy rate overall in Greater Portland went up last year from 7 to 8.15%. John will bring up some graphs here. This is downtown vacancy rates. When John said in his intro about bucking trends, I think our vacancy rate's up. Everyone's up. We're similar in that way. Where we kind of buck the national trend is that actually the CBD has improved. You can see here vacancy rates over the last 5 years. Obviously 2020 is where things spiked, but there's been a steady decline, especially in the Class B markets, which were hit first and hardest in downtown Portland. And even Class A, which has kind of gone up or down a little bit, but is down. So we're not quite out of the woods yet, but for 2025, there are a lot of positive signs right now going into the market. One is that the overall sublease rate, which has really been driving rates up the last few years since COVID. And this is because leases were signed pre-COVID. Companies didn't know what to do with their excess space, so they either gave all their space up or half of it or a part of it or whatever. And that's just been getting added to the market year after year. And last year was the first year that sublease rate went down because that has been competing with direct vacancies the last couple of years. So that's a good sign. The other thing is demand. I think last year was the largest number of lease transactions over the last 7 years. So that's a positive thing. Even significant transactions over 10,000 square feet. I've given this presentation in the past where there have been 2, even pre-pandemic. And last year, I think there were like 15. So that's the positive trend for going into this year. Another trend is, I've talked a lot about flight to quality and in the past where, vacancy rates for Class A properties go up, lease rates go down, and then there's this kind of flight where it's an opportunity for a Class B tenant to get into a Class A building. This year it's changed. I think it's more of a flight to experience is what I'm calling it, and more so to kind of what Gina was talking about with amenities. A lot of the relocations last year have to do with improving the experience for the employees and the company. That can be through relocation to maybe a more vibrant area of town, which is why downtown is doing so well. And that's part of it, but also adding the amenities to the building, creating a workplace that is inclusive and where people want to be. So that's certainly a trend that we're going to see continuing. The suburban lease rates, maybe John can go to that one, are not doing so hot. And we kind of anticipated this. There were some bigger movements a few years ago where we anticipated that the suburban rates were going to go up. Right now, this is just direct rates. If you combine the vacancy rate or the sublease rates, that pushes it up almost 20%, which is the highest rate that we've ever recorded in the suburban markets. You go even kind of more direct around the main mall in suburban Portland area, a 1 mile radius of the main mall. That vacancy rate, or the vacancies in that area, account for 80% of all suburban vacancies, and you're pushing over 30% for a total rate. So, in terms of bucking the national trend, the suburban rates are high. They're just a lot of large vacancies. And while there were some big transactions in those markets last year, they just weren't enough to offset the vacancies. We had a broker in our office talk that they're putting a survey together for a tenant for 15,000 square feet, and there were 27 options to choose from. I did a survey for a downtown tenant the other day, and there were 3. So, that's just the difference of obviously where opportunities lie for some tenants, but those are some of the major trends. And then quickly, I think the last trend I see where it really didn't happen too much last year, but the conversions from office space to residential, or office space even to industrial. There are a couple opportunities there, or to medical. I think those will continue. Actually, John, if you go back to the downtown vacancy rates, the Class B market, that improvement over 21, 22, 23, the gray graph, was really because we were taking dated vacant office buildings off the market because they were getting converted. I think our survey, which we do every year, and actually this is our market outlook, we just released it today, takes a deep dive into the office market, but we removed close to 500,000 square feet of office space downtown in the Class B market. Last year, that rate improved solely from absorption of leasing. We didn't account for any conversions last year. They had already been done the year before. So just more, strength towards the downtown market.
Do you think that do you think those conversions are going to continue, or have all the buildings which are already kind of the right shape, the low-hanging fruit for conversions, have those been picked off, and now it's going to be more difficult to find those?
So I think the low-hanging fruit has been picked off, but there still are other opportunities. And I don't know if they're public, but there are 3 buildings I can think of right now that are kind of in the design planning board process to be converted. And one of them is for higher education, another one for hospitality, another one for housing. So I think that will continue to happen.
I want to talk about something you also touched on, and that is how nationally the suburban markets tend to be doing better. But in Greater Portland specifically, it seems like that's where most of the vacancies is, mostly up by the mall. Now, also nationally, it's the downtowns that are hurting. Like I think when we were having one of our prep meetings, you mentioned that Boston's at like 35%, but Portland's downtown, because of its experiential nature, that seems to be doing a lot better. And this is kind of a question for the two of you. Why do you think that is?
So Portland's smaller. It's more nimble. The average size company is smaller. It was easier to make decisions to get people back into the office. People wanted to be in the office. They wanted to see your friends. It's easier to get into downtown. It's easier to park next to your building and walk in. In Boston, you're talking about 20, 30-minute commute. Then you got to walk 4 blocks from your parking garage into your building to take the elevator to the 30th story. It's just more complicated. And I think probably the flip side of that is that Boston has not stopped building. Surprisingly, with high vacancy rates, they're still adding more. And, Portland is much more conservative. It's more of a you come, we build it type mentality. So there's no overbuilding happening here. So Portland was just able to be more nimble and absorb, the pandemic a little bit better, from that sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something to that too, where we have such a kind of like mixed use, like rich array of mixed use, I guess, in downtown. So I think, I mentioned during our prep sessions as well, we have an office in Schenectady, New York, and I've, been trying to pay attention to what's happening in the Albany area. And, downtown Albany is really struggling because they were so reliant on office space in that area to drive retail and drive restaurants. And our downtown, we already have a tourist industry. We have, a lot of residential already. So we just have a lot of more opportunity just kind of built into our kind of the canvas of our community. I think, definitely a huge point there with in Boston, it's the commutes are, travel for us. Like if we have traffic on our commute, it's like a 5-minute swing. So it's all relative for us. But I think a big piece of downtown too is that, in terms of amenities, and I think Nate really touched on this, is that, amenities don't have to be under your roof if you're downtown. If you have walkable lunch and coffee shops and places for people to connect outside of your walls, that's a huge opportunity.
It's also, for the company, it's a low cost way to improve your experience, as opposed to ripping your space apart and rebuilding or adding golf simulators. It's like just move to the coffee shops and restaurants.
Right. The suburban buildings are where they really, I think, need to focus more on the amenities piece and really offering a lot to to have people want to be there, and also offer conveniences. If you're out in the suburbs and you have to get in your car to go get lunch, that's a huge inconvenience and a loss of your productivity in the day.
Gina, when you meet with a client and you're trying to design them an office space that sort of hits their amenitized goals and things like that, what are some of the expensive things they look at? So things that aren't like there's a coffee shop next door, there's parking nearby. What are the types of things that people are doing? What are the decisions they're making?
I think, going back to the well-being piece, we're seeing a lot of variety in work settings within spaces. And it's going to this making the office environment really functional for people when they come in, and thinking about DEI strategies, making sure that everybody feels welcome in the work environment. I think we have a greater awareness of the impact and prevalence of physical and cognitive differences, that, cognitive differences don't just have to be, specific diagnoses. Everybody experiences spaces differently. Everybody has different needs in the workplace. And so I actually saw a presentation recently that had a really great graphic that expressed that. And it was 3 people were given the same bike. One was a child, one was an adult with physical disabilities, and one was an adult without physical disabilities. So only one person could use the bike. And I think that really kind of is a great narrative for, having a lot of choice and variety in work environments. So, for instance, we have somebody in my office who is autistic, and she has a hard time working at her own workstation. Her, designated assigned private office, she gets really overstimulated. So she can go into one of our focus rooms, close the door, be by herself, and be able to refocus and recenter. So having these different opportunities within the space where people can have different levels of surround, be able to take a different posture, have a lot of adjustability, things that really meet their needs, really move the needle.
There's this trend that's been kind of playing out in Portland since COVID, and it's, there's a certain amount of supply of office square footage, and demand has gone down a little bit, right? All these insurance companies out by the mall have left. People who have traditionally been downtown users may be going from 40,000 square feet to 20,000 square feet. And what we're sort of seeing is that some buildings are staying at near 100% occupancy rates, and other buildings are getting more and more of the vacancy. I'm curious, do you guys notice any commonalities between the buildings that do a good job attracting tenants and buildings which do a poor job attracting tenants?
I mean, I think part of it is, again, the overall experience and how much money are you going to have to invest to make the space what you want it to be and offer the experience that you want it to offer. And so I think, a lot of the spaces that have really large floor plates, for instance, make it really hard to have access to natural light. And that's a huge driver for people. Again, with those mutual benefits, it's really helpful to employees for their personal well-being. It's really helpful for, productivity and thinking about business performance. Natural light is huge. So that's one piece of it. I think also even just something like ceiling heights, if you have a low floor to floor and you can't get, a great experience because you've got kind of low ACT ceilings, then that can be hard and costly to do anything about. That can be a real barrier.
Any comment on that, Nate?
Yeah, I mean, I think access to natural light, workable floor plans, the large cube farms are dated, they're out. It's expensive to redo these office spaces. And so I think that's part of what attracts tenants is a space that's workable. Some of them are just really difficult and will cost a lot of money, and depends on whose pocket that's coming out of. For downtown, I mean, still, the ease of coming in downtown, that's why it's doing so. We talked about the accessibility. People still want parking. So I think the buildings that have an easier access to parking, it can be a block or two away, but just having that there. And parking's much better than it was pre-COVID, but still it's an amenity. And, either having parking on site or, the ability, some garages are developing the ability to have 30 parking passes because you have 30 employees, but only 20 of them are going to be used at any certain point of time. So having that technology with the parking is certainly a big amenity.
What are you seeing as a broker for how are landlords winning deals? Let's say you have a 10,000 square foot office user looking for a downtown office space. They're looking at 4 or 5 different vacancies. They end up selecting one. What's the driving factor there?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the amenities that we've just mentioned. It doesn't have to be views, but natural light, on-site management, concierge, or at least a management company that's attentive. That's a big thing, and keeping up with capital repairs. Landlords are not moving off lease rates too much. A little bit of wiggle room. I think they're still viewing this as maybe a temporary problem, that if you reduce a lease rate, that is a long-term problem. And so what are some of the short-term things that a landlord can do? Is free rent, it's tenant improvement packages, which, used to be a standard $20 a square foot. Now that's probably more like $40 to $60 a square foot for office space. Free rent, which used to be 2 or 3 months, now you're looking at 9 to 12 plus months of free rent. So that's something that landlords can do to attract. But it's really about the amenities and the quality of the building. And when I say this flight to experience, that's real. And the location and, an on-site attentive management or landlord.
Why is it an issue for landlords to lower their rent for a 10-year term?
Well, even if a landlord has no intent of selling, they still may need to leverage the building, have an appraisal, estate planning, and you drop a lease rate $2 a square foot, then that's going to affect your overall valuation of the building long term. Now, then maybe you drop the lease rate for the first year, and then it bumps up $2 or $3 a square foot in year 3, seeing a little bit of that. But in terms of hey, this is historically a $26 a square foot building. Now, because the vacancy rate's 25% in that building, now it's a $21 a square foot building. That's not really happening.
I'm trying to think of a thoughtful way to go on that. I have a point that I'm trying to drive at here. I'm trying to ask questions to get there. If you, I'll have to think about that. I want to get back to this. I know I'm the moderator, not the panel.
You want me to say that all the buildings are dire and they're all going to go to foreclosure soon?
No, I just, I think there's a lot of brokers in this audience. I think there's a lot of landlords in this audience. And I want them to take away from this what they need to do to be winning these tenants in what is, I would say, a tenant-friendly market right now. So,
well, yeah, you have a tenant who has a survey with 27 options on it. Where do you even start? Obviously there's a budgetary part of all of this, right? There are going to be some spaces that are completely above the budget and you just cross those off. There are going to be some that are too low. One thing that we do our office with a tenant rep assignment is we look at all the zip codes for all the employees, and we kind of do a study on commute times and where they're located, and should you be north of Portland, should you be south of Portland? So there's a little bit of a location analysis that goes with it. But to really differentiate yourself, we never talk about curb appeal in commercial real estate, but there's curb appeal. It's really that first impression. You walk into the lobby, and lobby renovations are something that can be done inexpensively and make a big difference and have a really great first impression.
We talked about how, Gina, you made the point that buildings that have good access to natural light, that have higher ceiling heights, those are the buildings that tend to attract the tenants these days. Unfortunately, those are exactly the same qualities that a building that is ripe for repositioning as a multifamily or as some other use need to have. Portland has a lot of these, particularly up on Congress Street, right? You have a lot of these older buildings which were constructed back when you didn't have as much MEP running through the ceilings. What happens with those buildings, the ones that it's more difficult to get converted?
Great question. I think that's the $1 million question right now. Yeah.
I have this little thought in the back of my head the last couple of years that we've been removing all this office space from the market, that what happens when the market comes back and, everyone starts hiring and it gets crazy, and then we're going to be like, shit, we don't have enough office space. And so
can't say shit, Nate.
Any kids in the room? So anyway,
I hope we get to that point. I hope we get there.
Yeah, we removed 500,000 square feet of office space. A lot of it was dated, but we still need it. We're gonna need it. And so right now, those buildings that can't be converted, maybe they're in need of a major renovation. There's gonna be a tenant that's gonna come around. It's gonna happen. Maybe not this year or next year, but we still need the office space.
I want to switch gears and get into a little more of the hard numbers of this past year. Can we talk about some of the bigger deals that got done and how those shaped the market? And it can be big deals like someone leased a big chunk of square footage, but also talk about some major vacancies that came online and how those impacted your numbers on these graphs.
Yeah, great point. So I think in terms of some of the larger transactions, I was just looking at this list again a few days ago, and I was surprised. Not surprised, but reminded, there just were not a lot of large sale transactions last year. there was really one significant transaction or two significant transactions downtown, and one of them was Main Public buying, the old Portland Public Market building. That was 60 or 53,000 square feet of sublease space that was on the market last year that is now filled. So, that was a sale that had a positive impact on the market. 465 Congress Street sold last year. That is an old office building.
It's exactly what I was talking about.
Yeah. So that building, we actually removed that from the survey the year before because it had been approved for residential, but that is going away from office space to hospitality. So that's another transaction that was positive for the downtown market. Not a lot on the sales side, as I mentioned. On the leasing side, there were a lot, and even in the suburban markets, I think there were like maybe 3 or 4 leases over 20,000 square feet that were signed in the suburban market. But, when you have the sheer level of vacancy in the market right now, 4 deals a year isn't going to make much of a dent. And I think it's going to, maybe keep things steady, but it's not going to drive vacancy rates down. That in our report, that was one of my predictions, is that, yeah, there's demand, it's great, but unless we have 12 60,000 square foot tenants come in next year, we're really not going to see that vacancy rate trend very down much. On the terms of large vacancies, I think last year, John reminded me that he watched my presentation from last year and that I predicted the vacancy rate was going to be the same. Thank you, John. It was not. So one of those things, I always have the caveat that they're surprises, and one of those was TD Bank. Moving out of the West Falmouth building, and they leased a good chunk of space. It was a significant transaction, 25,000 square feet in the Unum building, but they vacated 143,000 square feet. And for a market our size, a deal like that makes a huge difference. We're just not a big market. So the big deals, the big vacancies certainly swing the numbers both ways.
Gina, I want to talk about the labor market. So it's changed a lot. There's fewer people. I've heard from a lot of my clients that it's difficult to hire employees, quality employees, people who have some experience. So if you have, if you treat labor like it's another commodity and there's a lack of supply, there's a lot of demand for it right now, what are people doing with their office spaces to compete for a finite labor pool?
So I think, it's again about this, experience piece. And I think it does go a lot bigger though than just your space. And it's a lot about your culture and who you are as an organization. And there are things that you can do to tell that story with your space. One big thing that SMRT has done is that we have, our Portland office is WELL Silver certified. So going back to that well-being piece, it's really important to people, and work-life balance is really important to people. And so if you start to tell the story of who you are as an organization with some of these big picture moves in your space, not saying that everybody needs to get WELL certified, but really kind of weaving some of that into your space to make sure that people know that that's something that you value is something that can make you stand out. I think, we talked a little bit about sort of return to office policies too. And I think that, the policies and kind of flexibility, that's another thing that people are really looking at right now. So it's bigger picture than just your space. It's really who you are as an organization.
When you guys track like these major blue chip companies and their return to office policies, or when the federal government was talking about having a major sweeping return to office policy, did you think that would impact companies in Maine?
I always hesitate to say no, I never would have thought, yes, obviously there's going to be a scenario where it does impact things. But I think, with return to office policies, I think that the hype in the headlines aren't telling the story of what's actually happening out there in the world. And so the Flex Index is actually really cool. It's they track what organizations are doing globally in terms of their kind of policies around return to office or work from home. And so their data shows that there's actually a downward trend in full-time in office, which I think is really interesting. It went down in 2023, stayed pretty flat in 2024. So I think, we're seeing that things are really leveling out. And again, people are really valuing, their flexibility and really valuing work-life balance. And that is a top consideration when people are, figuring out their career moves.
Nate, I want to talk about the medical sector as well. This is a total switching gears, but when we were doing our preps, we didn't really hit on this one, but medical is just extremely low. So just for everyone in the audience's sake, this is downtown, here's suburban, significantly higher, but medical just seems to be an anemic market. Can we talk about why that is?
Well, if you're a landlord, it's a great market. So I used to put this graph up that showed the vacancy rate over 25 years, and every time, at least the downtown vacancy rate would drop below 3% or 2%, there'd be new construction. It was like clockwork. Obviously, that's not happening now if you look at those previous two graphs. But in the medical world, other than office conversions to medical, which, there were a couple buildings out in the Foden Road area of South Portland that were converted. That was, several years ago now.
That's from office to medical?
From office to medical. Really, the only option is new construction. And so, that's why we saw the Rock Row Medical Campus take off. And, obviously they landed the anchor tenant, I think it was New England Cancer, and then the other ones fell. There's just not a lot of options out there. There was even a retail center at one point in South Portland being considered for conversion to medical. So, it's a very tight market. It has been that way for a long time. I think it's 1.3% vacancy is where it was last year for both Class A and B. Though that graph doesn't seem to line up with that. But anyway, that really speaks to, I think there's like 4 vacancies on the market total. So it's a tight market. It's a great market. If you're a medical tenant, start the search now. It's going to take a while. So
new construction is very expensive too.
Yeah, you're talking about let's say a suburban office rate that you're going to convert. That base rate's going to be maybe $18 to $24 a square foot. Obviously, you're going to have some construction costs with that to get it to medical, but new construction medical costs are going to be in the upper 30s to low 40s per square foot.
Okay, well, we've kind of touched on all the big points that I had. Do you guys have any other points that you want to get across?
I think we hit a lot of the high points. Yeah.
I think I forgot to mention when you were asking about large transactions. There were several large downtown transaction deals.
The leases
for leases. Yeah, we didn't really. I think the big one last year, there were some big renewals. Pierce Atwood renewed, and I think Bank of America renewed as well. But like Diversified Communications as like a flight to experience, their space was very nice, but it wasn't an area where they were in the arts district that's known for downtown professional office space. So, they relocated to, I think it's like 35,000 square feet at 2 Portland Square. So really kind of moving right into the middle of it now, downtown. So that was a significant transaction. On Point Health Data was another one where, they went from 7,000 square feet to 23,000 square feet last year.
And they went from Washington Ave down to the Covetrus building.
Yeah, the Covetrus building. Talk about natural light. I don't think you can get any more natural light in a building than the Covetrus building. Like, maybe too much, actually. That was really, they moved 4 blocks, but their former space was an old warehouse. It was cool.
Yeah, they had really interesting space.
Yeah, they had cut like a light well into it with a little interior courtyard. That's what you do with turning industrial space to office space. But they went from 2 windows to like 500 windows. So
yeah, and really prepared for their future. They took a lot of extra space, knowing that they have a lot of growth coming down the line. So doing that sort of advanced thinking is really
and that deal, especially what drove that is the amenity piece. The Covetrus building, what they saw the value in that were a large number of meeting rooms that were on site that they could use, as well as a boardroom. So I worked with 3 tech companies last year that all relocated, that the majority of their workforce is in Maine, but the last 5 years, they've been hiring all over the country. And they get together once a quarter, twice a year, something like that. And so I know for On Point, they have a big all hands meeting twice a year. So that boardroom was a big deal. And actually a smaller tenant that also went to that building, Vitro Fiber Map as well, saw a big need for that boardroom. So.
That trend of having a company that's headquartered in Maine, and then they have those different employees who are scattered throughout the country. They work remotely. They may come to Maine once a quarter, once a half, once a year, whatever it may be. Is that a trend that you're seeing more and more?
I think for certain with those 2 companies, when I heard how many employees they had, and I don't want to say numbers because I'm going to get them wrong, but it was more than I thought. I thought it was maybe like 3 or 4 employees, and it's more like more than 15, to 30 out of like 100. So it's a big percentage.
And I think too, during the pandemic, when we saw a lot of remote workers kind of start to, come to Maine for the quality of life, and I think we were really hoping to see a lot of large organizations decide to either have an outpost in Maine or come to Maine. I'm not sure that we've seen that happen, but I guess I'm still hopeful that maybe it will.
Yeah, I think we were kind of hoping after the pandemic that all the billionaire CEOs were going to say, I hate New York, I'm going to move to Maine, and I'm going to get my company here.
Yep.
I don't think
fingers were crossed.
Where I was going with that, so as other companies throughout the rest of the country, they hire people, they can't get them to come into the office, but those people want to work remotely. Maine's a pretty attractive place to live, and the keynote speaker today even touched on this. There's an increasing number of people who move to Maine. They work for companies in Boston, New York, D.C., wherever, but they work here, and I think that that's going to have a bit of an impact on the amount of co-working space. Have you guys seen any major co-working deals that got done this past year, and what's their absorption rate been like?
I mean, IWG, do I have that right? Regis? Yeah.
Regis.
So they leased Hutchins Drive, Woodward and Curran moved downtown, possibly Flight to Experience there. So their space was backfilled partially by co-working. 400 Congress Street across from City Hall. I think there's 15,000 square foot co-working space there, and I think they're doing well talking with those managers. It just allows, I think companies have figured out the hybrid thing, but sometimes they need a little more flexibility, and I think those co-working spaces allow that flexibility either in transition or maybe if it's a company that works with a lot of contracts and they have a heavy season, they're able to kind of overflow to some of these spaces.
I mean, and we are still definitely feeling the epidemic of loneliness. There are still enough people working remotely where that's a factor. And there's actually there's a great Gallup study, the State of the Workforce report, does a really nice job of kind of showing, the impact of even people working hybrid coming in a few days a week really helps with that, sense of daily loneliness. So at least, people having the opportunity to go to a co-working space where they're interfacing with others, I think is really beneficial.
Yeah, I was talking with a friend maybe a couple months ago, and Amazon or Google, one of them was announcing January 1st was everyone back to the office. And my friend had a kid that was like 26 or 27 working for this company, and they were psyched to get back into the office. They were like buying ties, they were getting ready to go because they had never worked in a professional office environment where people were there. You know what I mean? And they were excited to get back in there. They just hadn't had that opportunity yet.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to be said with generational stereotypes, and I try not to go there too much because there's always people who don't fall in line with the stereotype. But I think there's a little bit of a mixed bag there with the younger generation of people who are really excited about the opportunities for mentoring, and some people who are really hesitant about it because that's a world that's unfamiliar and a world that's unknown of kind of coming into the office and interacting with other people, and that there's a lot of skills, a lot of soft skills on that front that people have a long way to go to learn. Sorry, Gen Z.
So we've got about 10 minutes left here. We have time for a few questions from the audience. Please, if you have any questions, start coming up to the microphone. If there's a lot of you, you can just form a queue. Please use the microphone. We have set up for questions. Sorry, I should prep more. We kindly ask that you refrain from sharing long comments, but instead ask a direct question for our panelists to answer.
Be fast, thank you. Nate, do you really think that the demand for office space is coming back, or did I misunderstand you earlier?
Yeah, so one thing I do, high technology over here, is that I count every office lease that's signed every year. And it's not the most scientific way of measuring demand because I count a 500 square foot, actually, I don't do anything under 1,000 square feet, but I count 1,000 square foot office has the same weight as a 100,000 square foot office deal. So, that really just speaks to the movement, of what's happening in the market. But I think at a low point, and say it's not that hard to count because I think in 2021 was a low point in terms of volume, and I think it was like 82 leases were signed in all of Greater Portland that year. And last year, I think it was like 150 something. So that's one way to measure demand. The other thing is, I work with a lot of tenants. I represent a lot of landlords. I constantly are speaking with all the other brokers in the market, and there are just a lot more showings, and there are a lot more tenants we track at our office. We track every single tenant that's in the marketplace at any given time, and there's just a lot more that are in the market. Now, some may renew, but we're seeing a lot of relocations and a lot of tenants in there, and I think that's going to continue. I'm aware of 3 tenants now. They're all significant size that are looking at deals close to deals for this year already.
I mean, and I think that there is, some big picture market growth that has to do with that. I think we're going to see, I saw a really interesting new acronym, it's fear of becoming obsolete. But I think actually we're going to see technology create jobs. There's, again, another great report from the World Economic Forum that suggests that AI is actually going to create new jobs. So I think it's that bigger picture kind of, economic growth that would make that happen, as opposed to say, I think, again, we're going to continue to see hybrid work and not necessarily see this big sweeping return to 5 days a week in the office that's going to create an explosion of need.
One thing to add too. So Nate, you talked about how you track that transaction volume. In a normal economic cycle, you have a trough, you have a climb, you have an apex, then it goes back down, and things just kind of continue on over the decades. That transaction volume, do you think that's a better indicator that we're either going up or down and just not in a trough, or do you think the sheer number of transactions is an indication of an improved economy?
Yeah, that's a great question, because another low point in transaction volume was in 2018, but that was because the vacancy rates were below 5%. So there just weren't a lot of options to go. And so there were a lot of renewals, there were a lot of people just kind of kicking the can down the road, waiting for the market to free up a little bit. And so, I haven't actually I haven't graphed those numbers in comparison with the vacancy rate. I would imagine they'd lag a little bit, like a year maybe, of what the vacancy rate is. But that's something for next year. Good idea.
Paul, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I didn't think you guys were going to stop talking.
We have 8 minutes left, so we got some filler.
Gina, can you say a little bit more about well-being?
Yeah.
That's been important for our office, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, there's just so many different things that you can do to, again, really make an impact for people. I've mentioned previously in one of our prep sessions that actually, like, noise and acoustics are a huge source of workplace stress. Giving people places to go within your work environment where they have personal privacy. I don't know how many times over the course of my career in talking with people that they, have to go out to their car to, like, call their doctor or, have a personal conversation or cry after a hard meeting or something. So just having these opportunities for people to do that within the work environment, to meditate, to pray, again, thinking about, DEI initiatives is really huge. So I think, our WELL certification has been huge for us as this, really tangible way for us to express the commitment that we've made to well-being. And I think that there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah, when we just moved into our office a little over a year ago, we, I think, have an open concept. I mean, there are some people that are in workstations and having those rooms. I think there are 3 different options to go to in our office that you can kind of get away. And we have the phone booths. When we bought those, I was like, we couldn't buy just one because it looked weird. So we had to get 2. And we got 2. I was like, no one is going to use these. Like, what are we going to, we're going to have to give these away. But they get used all the time. Like, I'm walking through our foyer all the time. There's someone chatting in there. Even someone that has an office is in the phone booth. So I don't know what they're yelling about. But.
Functionally, it's usually someone comes screaming off the elevator with a phone, and they have to pop right in one of those.
Yeah, you can yell louder in the phone booth than you can in your office.
Yeah. They are pretty soundproof. They really are. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
We have 6 minutes, guys.
Right. I can keep talking about well-being. I didn't want to go too deep there. There's a lot to say.
Ken, go ahead.
I got one for you. A lot of the discussion has been about the larger trends and larger transactions, larger spaces. Could you take a few minutes to talk about all the volume that's done for smaller spaces?
Yeah. I mean, that was the first thing when COVID hit. The small office users were gone, right? I mean, most of them were in month-to-month leases. They have an office, they just gave that up. And then that came screaming back like a year or 2 ago. And because I think part of it, this is just my own brain saying this, but they went home, they worked. They were like, well, that was fun for a year, but let's get back to getting out of the house. I have lots of friends that work from home full time. They love it. It's fine. But I think, the larger population was looking just to get back. And so there are a couple of buildings that I help manage leasing on. They're smaller offices, and it's just, it's a constant demand. It's a lot of musical chairs. Some people try it out for 6 months and they're gone. But, in terms of the number of transactions, number of transactions is doubled in the last 3 years, but our vacancy rate still went up. So that just shows you that there's more activity on the smaller side, on the smaller scale. And once again, that the larger transactions the larger vacancies shape the market.
I can speak to this a little bit too. So if I'm doing a tenant rep for someone who's looking for 2,000 square feet, they generally have a good sense of what their program is going to be. You know, they may say, I want a small conference room and I have 7 offices and a small kitchenette. We go out, and what I try to do as the broker is find a space that already perfectly works for that program, because these small users, they typically don't sign these 10, 15-year leases. They'll sign a 3 or a 5-year lease. And if you have to do any work to that space, work is extremely expensive right now. Interest rates are high, and they're probably going to have to, get a bank loan or an SBA loan, amortize it over the initial term of that lease. If you have to do work to a space and you're only signing a 3-year lease and you're a small company who's presumably pretty not insulated from a high carrying cost of your monthly expenses, it's kind of a deal killer. So if I'm a landlord, I would be, every time you do a build out, make sure that whatever the program is that you're designing to, not just this company can use it, but another company could hypothetically use it relatively easily.
Good point.
I have a quick one, but I'm not going to go to the mic.
I think you have to, for the recording purposes. Sorry to make you do it.
Quick one, little sidebar. Do you guys have any insight into vacant spaces on the restaurant front in that part of the market?
Might have to go to the retail talk for that one.
We might have a couple things.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Should I go first?
Sure.
Yeah. I had a listing, 111 Middle Street. It's directly across from 100 Middle Street, or next to the police station. It was Piccolo for a number of years, and then it went vacant. We had it on the market for probably 5 months, and we had Reese McFarland and I in my office. We probably had 20 showings. There are a ton of restaurateurs who are out there who are looking. They all get into it. They start to analyze the numbers. They start to hear from other restaurateurs that's very difficult to hire help, particularly in the front of the house, and they just get discouraged. So I think of those 20 showings, like 2 of them came into a letter of intent. 1 of them actually got all the way to a signed lease.
I think what's moving away in the restaurant world is the old days of where a restaurant used to just rent this vacant vanilla box, put $1 million into building out the restaurant, pay $1 or $2 more per square foot than what a traditional retail space would be. There's just a lot of upfront capital that I think restaurants are shying away from. And at the same time, there are opportunities for turnkey restaurants right now in the Old Port and even outside of downtown Portland. So you don't have to do that. And so I think that's part of that is the loan piece to it. Maybe there's not as much private money in the restaurant business as there used to be. But I think these large build outs, they're extravagant, spending all this money. I think those are probably in the past for right now.
And to Nate's point, this is probably a question that's better for the retail discussion, but I'm glad you asked that, because one of the points we were trying to drive home during this panel is that Portland has just simply done a lot better with their downtown office vacancy rates than other major metropolitan areas. I think Boston's like 35%.
Not quite that high, but it's high.
It's high. And Portland, I'll bring this back up. Here's our vacancy rates. Between Class A and Class B, you're probably at, a total of 12%?
Well, you don't add them
that correct?
together, but the average is, yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, numbers are tough. But
it's under 6%.
Okay, good. One of the reasons that Portland does so much better is because downtown is just a cool place to be. Yeah. The prospect of living in Woburn and then having to take a bus to a train to the next T stop, switch trains, and then walk 15 minutes through the rain and the snow to your office, it's just unappealing. And then once you get there, it's like you have Chipotle and Qdoba. In Portland, when you come downtown, you can drive into the city relatively quickly. There is some parking available, and then you have all these cool coffee shops, restaurants to go into. So the whole business ecosystem is kind of symbiotic. The health of the restaurant industry it has an impact on the health of the office market as well.
So add on to that, though, and I think a really important part to make, we'll make in the last 30 seconds of this, is that our vacancy rates don't reflect probably of what the occupancy is of a company's for what they're using their space. I'm not saying this well. So a company might lease, 4,000 square feet, but they might have 2 people in there. You know what I mean? And so I think that there are a lot of these companies that I've heard of the larger sort where you have a 100,000 square foot building and maybe, 10,000 is occupied at any point in time. So there are just fewer people downtown. So our vacancy rates don't reflect that. Because the tenant is paying on the entire building, we call it 100% full, when in fact it probably really isn't 100% full.
So it's
Sounds
leased,
like
but
a
it's
lot
not.
of people would need planning services.
Sounds like it. Well, no, that would increase the sublease rate. I don't think we need to do that.
I think we're getting the hook here. I got one last thing to say. Thank you for joining us today. You have about 10 minutes before the next session begins at 2 p.m. The sessions include municipal trends in room A, which is right over there, the industrial outlook in room B, which is this room, and the construction outlook in room C. The sessions you registered for are listed on the back of your name tag. Let's keep these conversations going. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, John.